back to today's video. Today is Friday, August 8th, 2025, and today we are going to be talking about the state of Alaska and Congresswoman Mary Peltola, who lost re-election in the 2024 election year. It has been a while since we have talked about Mary Peltola and her candidacy, because now it looks like she stands to be the Democratic Party's likeliest candidate to run for governor in the 2026 year, and the most successful one in recent memory for the Alaska Democratic Party. Now, if you remember, our coverage of Mary Peltola started in 2022 in an August special election. That was when the Congresswoman ran against Sarah Palin, Nick Begich, and a number of other candidates in a multi-way race. And what happened was that in the final round of ranked choice voting, Mary Peltola went from starting out in a position where she was hovering around third and fourth place to ending up winning against Sarah Palin, who had served as governor of the state of Alaska. And looking at the monumental time at which that really came about, as if you look back at the House elections in 2022, that was a very substantial victory for the Democratic Party. But it didn't necessarily come easy. The special election in the state of Alaska led to the inevitable November election, where Mary Peltola won by 10 points instead of just 3 points in the runoff. It was a massive, massive performance for Mary Peltola, and one that showed that she was on track to do very well in this state, being the first Democrat to hold this seat in a very, very long time. The last time that this seat was held by a Democrat, I think you have to go all the way back. If we can go through the primary, it might not even be here on the map, because if you look, we can't even find the time at which Democrats last held the seat. The point is that in 2022, she became the first Democrat to win this seat, who replaced Don Young. Don Young had served in this seat since 1972 up until 2022, when he unfortunately passed away, prompting the special election. But after Mary Peltola was able to win this race in 2022 by 10 points, and then went on to the next election and got the House results in the state down to a margin of about 2 points across the state when Donald Trump was winning Alaska by 14 percentage points, her name became one that was all too familiar in Democratic circles in the state of Alaska as they looked to candidates in the 2026 election cycle and what they knew what was going to be an open governor's race in this election. While a lot of people have floated the idea that maybe she decides to run for Senate, it looks like she's much more inclined to run for governor, as it is being described as, quote, wide open. And arguably that makes a lot of sense. If you take a look at what's happening in the state of Alaska, you'll find that in 2026 they do have a coinciding Senate election. But this is with an incumbent, Dan Sullivan, who is running for re-election, who is arguably more popular than other Republican politicians across the state, and won re-election in 2020, outperforming the top of the ticket being Donald Trump in this state by about a point, but won re-election by about 12 in 2020. And if in 2024, Mary Peltola did lose an election as the incumbent in the House race over national partisan politics, it stands to reason that a governor's race would be easier to win as someone from her caliber of candidacy and electoral performance than a Senate race that is nearly replicating the exact result of the 2024 election. Now, 2026 could look entirely different, and her decision to run for Senate could be a very beneficial one for the Democratic Party. But a decision to run for governor would be all more inspiring for the party and significantly more winnable, given the circumstances of a governor's race, again, are contained to how voters believe you will perform within the state boundaries. Now, the Alaska governor's race has a lot of Republicans who want to run, anyone from former state senators to the incumbent lieutenant governor. You have a long list of Republicans who are in this race. But on the Democratic side, you really don't have anybody. Tom Begich, who right now is considering that he might run for the governorship in the state of Alaska, has already said that if Mary Peltola decides to run for governor, he's not going to run. But if she decides to run for something else, he'll throw his name in the ring, right? He'll throw his hat in the ring and say, I want to run for governor. But Mary Peltola's candidacy is strong enough to the point that Tom Begich, yes, related to Nick Begich, who's now the representative, the Republican who had beaten Mary Peltola in the 2024 race, is now considering this bid as a Democrat, has always been a Democrat, should make no misunderstandings about that. But Mary Peltola's candidacy, again, is so strong, and the possibility of it, that other Democrats are already saying that if she decides to run, they will not. And now looking at some data points. We haven't had them for some time in the state of Alaska. The last one we were looking at was all the way back in 2024 from the same firm that just released data for this cycle. They found it back in early 2024 that Mary Peltola was facing a close and competitive re-election. We didn't really do much after the primary either. We talked about Alaska a bit, but it wasn't the main focus. Obviously, the 2024 presidential was absorbing a lot of the oxygen. But the point is that in the state of Alaska, she was the most popular and stands to be still the most popular politician in the state. But the data had suggested that in a close race, it was going to be competitive. And so Peltola and Begich faced off against each other. Obviously, the result ended up with Begich taking the advantage. But now looking to the 2026 governor's race, her lead is far more impressive than being tied with a hypothetical Republican opponent. And it is because she is uniquely popular, and her prime Republican opponent, Nancy Dahlstrom, is so unknown, and largely of what voters do know about her, they don't like her. A lot of voters in Alaska see Dahlstrom as too extreme, a Palin redux in this cycle, not someone who was aligned with Begich. And even if you look back at the way she campaigned in 24, she often campaigned to the right of Nick Begich, trying to siphon votes away from him before she realized there was no viability. Then she did, put party over herself and endorsed Begich. But the point is that taking a look at this, taking a look at the approval ratings and the way that voters view them, Begich is well known. Dunleavy is well known. Sullivan is well known. Obviously, Trump is well known. Murkowski is well known. And Mary Peltola is more popular than all of them. And in contrast with Nancy Dahlstrom, significantly more so. And so, like I said, Peltola is the most popular politician across the state, no matter how you cut it. As an unelected official right now, she's more popular than both Republican U.S. senators, more popular than the Republican governor, more popular than the Republican president, more popular than the Republican incumbent House rep, and more popular than her prime opponent in this race, the lieutenant governor of the state. This is why she stands to be the most electable Democrat in the 2026 governor's race. But they didn't just ask about approval rating. That's one thing. Approval rating doesn't always translate to electoral victory, as she can tell you from the last cycle. But what it does tell you is that she stands to be a formidable candidate, like she was in 2024, losing a race by 2 points when Kamala Harris lost the state by 14. Outpacing the Democrats nationally by 12 points is certainly something that cannot be ignored. And thinking about this, you have to take a look. They have data. They asked voters first, how would you vote in a November 2026 general election between Dan Sullivan and Mary Peltola? And like I said, I often felt that running for another nationalized race would be a way to repeat the 2024 election. Do I think that Peltola could come closer than any Democrat has in a while and over a decade in the state of Alaska? Absolutely. But do I think, simultaneously, that her chances are better in the governorship? By a mile. Looking at that House result, it looks awfully similar to what we're seeing in the Senate result, because a lot of these voters in the state of Alaska, while they like and respect Mary Peltola, ultimately speaking, they aren't looking to vote for someone who would be a Democratic vote in Washington, D.C., but they might be more inclined to vote for her if she was contained again to the boundaries and the confinements of the state legislature in the state of Alaska. She lost this matchup in the hypothetical by about a point. Yes, room for growth, but nowhere near the lead that she has in the governor's map. Let's take a look. As we go down, the first, and because Alaska does ranked choice voting, they ask voters, who would you rank first in a matchup? And the combined Republican share here is not significant enough to overcome her, and that's largely because a lot of these voters that are looking at these Republican candidates just simply don't know them. But Mary Peltola starts out strong, with about 40% of the vote. Tom Begich, who has high name ID as well, gets about 6% of the vote, and the combined vote share might bring you to a point where it's similar to what her Senate result actually looks like, 46% as a combined vote share. But it actually doesn't go that way. Once you start to eliminate the lowest candidates and move up to the top four, Mary Peltola wins over a significant chunk of those voters that say that they're not sure or are voting already in that first round for potentially some other Republicans. She goes from 40% of the vote to a massive 54%. Now, this is after just a few rounds of running the ranked choice voting tabulation and doesn't even take into account everybody else in this race. Nancy Dahlstrom, Bernadette Wilson, Click Bishop, these are all Republicans who, might I add, that when you take a look at the data in this state and you take a look at where it is from the last cycle, Republicans should be in the advantage seat in this race. Mary Peltola is electorally strong, but it doesn't speak to the same point that, all of these Republicans should be losing in such a manner. And keep this in mind as we move forward. The combined Republican vote share amongst this group of these Alaska likely voters is 45%. So, if all of them were to back other Republicans, Nancy Dahlstrom likeliest of the bunch, to make it to the final round, it would stand to reason that the race would be about a 9-point race or a 10-point race. But that's not what you get. Similar to the effect of when Sarah Palin was on the map here. You found that in the final round here, if you were to do the full hypothetical, Nancy Dahlstrom would not come close to victory at all. By the time you reach the final round, we'll probably have to open this up here if we have the ability to. But the point is that by the time you reach the final round, Mary Peltola reaches a point where in head-to-head against Nancy Dahlstrom, they keep doing the ranked choice voting tabulation. We can find it here. This final round, 65, getting there, promise you, 65 to 35. A lot of Republicans, 14% say they back Mary Peltola. 73% of independents back Mary Peltola. She wins the vote amongst women, amongst men, under 45, 45 plus, no college, American Indian or Alaska Native, white, and across all different parts of the state. I mean, this is truly a display of electoral genius on the side of Peltola. And that is the reason why she won in 22. Despite the state voting for the same Republican representative for 50 years, their first Democrat was Mary Peltola, who came into that 2022 race, might I add, not as the frontrunner, not as someone who was expected to win. Take a look at this first round of the data. In the first choice here, she was at 39.66% of the vote. Palin and Begich were at 31 and 28. Combined, she should have lost by 20 points. But again, ranked choice voting is a very pesky thing for a lot of voters across this state, across the country too, because they might have liked Begich, but they couldn't fathom Palin. Right here was when a significant chunk of Begich voters said, I'm going to hold my nose and vote for the Democrat if it means defeating Sarah Palin. And eventually, they did get Nick Begich in the next election. But not by the margin that you would have expected, and certainly not by the margin that he would have won by in 2022. Because when she was in office in Alaska, became exceptionally popular. Voters really liked her. And that makes sense why they might want her for governor. But to the degree that they do is fascinating. Now, I'm not going to throw all my weight in one poll, but I will remind you that in 2024, it was Data for Progress that really raised the alarm flag here for Democrats that Mary Peltola might not have as easy of a re-election as the primary would inevitably suggest, and also not to mention, as the data in terms of popularity would also suggest. Mary Peltola and Nick Begich were only about a point off from what Data for Progress had predicted roughly half a year out from the election. We're more than a year out right now, but she stands to be a formidable opponent for the Republicans, and clearly, the Democratic frontrunner and the frontrunner in general in this election. And so now this will be a question for Peltola. Does she run for Senate or does she run for governor? Now, running for Senate, just bringing it back to this point just briefly, is something that I think, again, would likely result in an eventual loss for Peltola. But if 2024 had just been 2 points to the left, and let's say Alaska, instead of being a 14-point race, went back to where it was in the 2020 presidential election, being a state that was decided by about 10 points, Peltola would still be in Congress and would still be in Washington, D.C. But that's not the case, because the national environment was very different. So if she runs for Senate and the 2026 environment is very favorable for Democrats, there's a possibility that she wins her race there. Democrats have won Senate elections in Alaska in Democratic wave years. Just take a look at 2008 against a Begich, actually. Mark Begich won in this race. Again, all the same family in Alaska, a huge electoral dynasty on both sides of the aisle. But again, getting back to this point here, Begich won by 1.2 in 2008. It would be banking on a lot for Alaska to go this way in 2026, and I'm not sure that it will. The governorship, however, is a lot more open. And it is clear that a lot of voters really do like her, but don't want to send her back to Washington, D.C., and that her prime opponent, Nancy Dahlstrom, who is too extreme for 2024, would likely be perceived the same way in 2026. And if she gets to that point of running for governor, Dahlstrom against Peltola, I would bet on Peltola 9 times out of 10. And so what this data, I think, reiterates is what we knew from the beginning. Peltola would be better slated for governor, but stands to be a competitive candidate for Senate. It's ultimately her decision, but the chances of winning one, governor, are tremendously higher than the other, Senate. And while we will see what her decision is, it very much looks like she is remaining involved in Alaska politics, wants to run for something, obviously statewide, because that's the only thing you can really do coming from that Congress position. And taking a look at the maneuvering that she's already been making, the outspokenness she's already been doing, it is very clear, at least to me, that Peltola wants to stay in Alaska politics. To the degree that she does is entirely up to her. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video for you to watch, and then a playlist for my 2026 House election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.